So, remember you guys, in the first 3 rows here, you need to wear a mask. And in this side, you have to wear a mask, okay? That is this is the preference of the people who are sitting so that they feel safer and they feel like this is a safe environment for them, okay? So if you want to sit on this side, then you need to wear a mask. Front 3 rows, you need to wear a mask. There's obviously lots of room, right? Lots of room. Okay, I'm going to talk about foreign policy today. And I am an old person, which I know you all know, but sometimes comes as a big shock to me. And so whenever I talk about foreign policy, remember that I'm somewhat coming from a perspective that is Cold War in nature. My entire, childhood, teenage years, we were, that's the problem. You can't use a mouse, it doesn't go to the machine. Interesting. So until, 1991, really kind of 1989, but 1991, and so even my first couple of years of college, we're still talking about the Cold War. And so it's important that we, I messed that up. That I give you guys a little bit of history, okay? Because it sets the stage. And while some people who are military historians would prefer that I go back to the 19th century, I am not going to do that, okay? So feel relieved by this, all right? We'll move on. So the first thing you need to know about U.S. foreign policy is this. From its inception until World War II, we were isolationists in nature, okay? And that goes in part, just kind of the way that we were across the ocean. We wanted to stay out of wars in Europe. That was the main thing. And do our own business. We were very fortunate that there were many wars going on in Europe because Great Britain didn't have time to really turn their attention to the wayward colonies and bring us in line, because if they had, they would have, and successfully, okay? They had the greatest navy in the world, and the fact that we were somewhat friendly with them, they became our BFFs right after. I mean, we've been best friends forever. They kind of protected us when we did not have the ability to protect ourselves. We were isolationists in many ways because of our location geopolitically in the world. Okay? We were in the Western Hemisphere. Okay? We were protected by oceans on both sides. And secondly, because Britain was too busy to deal with us. Okay? So we had kind of a nice, 150 years of building ourselves up and not having to deal with war the way the rest of the world did. That's a big deal. So we were isolationists. George Washington, in his farewell address, admonished us not to become involved in entangling alliances with European powers. In other words, don't make yourself have to go to war because you have a treaty with a person that says if somebody else is at war with them, you have to go to war. Okay? But some things changed. The world changed. technology changed. There were things like airplanes. With World War I, we emerge onto the world scene and we ally ourselves with Great Britain, France, and at that time, what we do is we go into the war, we provide a lot of resources, and we are unscathed by it. Okay? I mean, there are lots of casualties, don't get me wrong. My great uncle John, who famously said, higher education is the ruination of youth, served in World War I, but he was a pacifist, and it was really hard for him. I don't know if you guys have seen War Horse, but he took care of the donkeys because that's what he was able to do, right? It was horrific. World War I was horrific. And people really believed that after World War I, there would not be another war like that. They thought it was a war to end all wars. But there were some mistakes made. And the big mistake that the United States made is that we walked away. When we walked away, then our weight in terms of, hey, this Treaty of Versailles seems like it could have some really bad repercussions. We did this with Reconstruction. It's a bad idea. But we walked away. We weren't willing to get involved in alliances. Woodrow Wilson went all around Europe and said, hey, let's form a League of Nations where together we agree mutually to support each other and to trade and to talk it out and not have war because of an assassination. And he came back to the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. Senate said, I mean, he sold it. He sold it in Europe. They were on board. But the League of Nations fails because they don't have the support of the United States. Because we had become such an economic power at that point that we could have really thrown some weight around. But we walked away. The Treaty of Versailles was a very punitive treaty. It's going to really punish Germany. And as a result, the German people become really resentful. Now, there's a Facebook video by Arnold Schwarzenegger that he released after the January 6th insurrection, in which he really clearly talks about the fact that he grew up with a father and with neighbors that were broken by World War II. He talks about the fact that Kristallnacht and that other uprisings occur, and because there's no punishment for it, well, Kristallnacht happens later, but the first occurs, and 10 years later there's no real punishment for it, and Adolf Hitler becomes Adolf Hitler. He was complicit. You don't think that fascism, you don't think that dictatorship can happen in a democracy, but it can. That demagoguery that we've talked about, pushing fear of other onto the population, this builds throughout Europe. The result is World War II. The United States enters World War II coming out of the Great Depression. We talked about this a little bit with Roosevelt. We do not enter, however, until the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. The Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor And we don't have an option. Okay? We actually thought they were going to hit Midway. So we left fewer boats there. We knew it was coming. But we thought they were going to hit Midway. We didn't know that they would be kamikazes. They were willing to die. We entered World War II with China as our ally, Great Britain as our ally, France as our ally. And when you look at the UN Security Council, who is on it? China. Oh, and the Soviet Union as our ally? China, the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. Because these are the 5 allies that win World War II. Understand that they still shape the way that the United Nations acts today, because they have permanent vetoes. World War II ended in 1946. Or 45, sorry. Or 1989, depending on how you look at it. Okay? So it ends in 1945. That means it's been 76 years?
This year. Well, kind of.
Huh?
I mean, Germany surrendered in 45, Japan in 46.
That's what I meant, 46. See, I was right. I knew I was right. You guys, come on. Don't let Eric correct me like that. So 75. 75 years since the end of World War II. And that war still is the reason that the world system is designed the way it is. The 5 allies still have permanent vetoes on the UN Security Council. Following World War II, we enter into the Cold War. The Cold War is between the United States and the Soviet Union. What happens during the Cold War is that we fight a lot of proxy wars. We support other sides in other places. The Soviet Union isn't hurt by it. The United States isn't hurt by it. But Vietnam is. Korea is. All of South America is. Quite a bit of Africa is. The bits in the Middle East as well. We fight our war somewhere else, clandestinely, without going quite far enough to actually spark mutually assured destruction. Because that happens pretty quick. At the end of World War II, the United States drops 2 nuclear bombs. The United States is the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons against another country. We dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. Why did we drop 2? Because they were willing to surrender after 1. What? It wasn't an unconditional surrender? It's part of it? Then they wanted to show the Soviet Union and the rest of the world.
It was September 2nd, 1945, when Japan surrendered in World War II.
Fine, Eric's fine. Eric's right. 76 years then.
Close enough.
Okay. By showing that we had 2, it meant we didn't only have 1. Okay? Because if we had only had 2, we would have kept 1. Right? But by dropping both, it meant we had more. Okay? This is a power play. Mutually assured destruction happens pretty quickly. By the early 1960s, if we attack the Soviet Union, their retaliatory strikes will destroy us as we destroy them, and probably destroy the world. Mutually assured destruction, which keeps most people from being willing to push the button. Now, if you guys want to watch Dr. Strangelove, you can find an example where that might be twisted in a different way. I'm giving you all sorts of movie references here. You guys really should check them out. But we have a bipolar power structure, and I'll show you that in just a second. In the 1970s, under Richard Nixon, we entered into a period of détente. Okay, containment, incidentally, is the Truman strategy. Containing communism. You know, we won't let it spread any further. That's where we draw the line. Okay? And communism isn't really the right word. Okay, it's what we called it, but totalitarianism is more accurate. Détente, however, Richard Nixon says, hey, let's just let things lie for a bit. Let's not push back. And we entered kind of this uneasy truce. In the 1980s, like I said, President Reagan really ran on this idea. President Carter, in between Nixon and Reagan, I just want to talk about his foreign policy for a second, because it was very idealistic. He said, hey, look, we cannot continue to support dictators who support us just because they don't support the Soviet Union. We need to strive for democracy. We need to support people who are democratic, not people who repress their people. He doesn't have a lot of sway. It's a very brief tenure. Reagan goes into office, he runs on 3 platforms, or 3 promises, and then one of them is to destroy the evil empire. Reagan was very lucky in some ways. The Soviet Union had been cooking its books for years. It looked like they were doing better than they were. Our spy report said they had all this stuff and they were doing really well because they thought they were, but they weren't. And so, by spending an extra $1 trillion during the 1980s on defense, an extra $1 trillion during the 1980s on defense, the Soviet Union had no option except for to try to keep up, and they bankrupted themselves, and the people sought freedom, right? We have a lot of soft diplomacy going on at the same time. Radio Free Europe, etc. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. I would argue that's actually the end of World War II. That's what a bipolar world looks like. We have the United States and its allies, the Soviet Union and its allies. Afterwards, we end up in more of a multipolar world. The Soviet Union does not have the kind of power, Russia does not have the kind of power it did before. It just doesn't. It doesn't have the money, it doesn't have the resources. It does not have that kind of power. And so the United States and its 3 closest allies, who turn out to be Great Britain, Germany, and Japan. There's a change for you. Are really closely linked in what they're doing. Soviet Union still has some links that make it a little stronger, but it just doesn't have the same sort of strength. And so we have powers, and the world is harder to organize. Okay? And like I said, you know, you guys occasionally watch James Bond movies, right? There's a point during the recent James Bond arc where Judi Dench's M says, Christ, I missed the Cold War. I'm like, yeah, it was easy. Bad guys, good guys, friends, enemies. It's not like that, right? So, the United States started a multilateralism approach. Eric, will you take roll? We have the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War in 1990. This is a UN-led action. Okay, the United States is the leader in the UN. Boutros Ghali, who has such a great name, you have to say it twice, is the Secretary General of the UN at the time. And he writes actually a treatise saying, hey, I think what ought to happen in the post-Cold War is the United States need to lead. They need to lead, but they need to listen to their allies. Okay? So we have the Gulf War in 1990. It's pretty straightforward. Iraq invades Kuwait. Kuwait is a member of the United Nations. And, done. Okay? I was in college during that. I was not aware that any Americans died. I just want you to know. Okay? Because the media treated this war very differently than it treated Vietnam, for example. In Vietnam, every night on the news, people watch body bags coming home. Every night. The media instead was embedded. And they didn't report the same way. I really remember news coverage as being kind of grainy, black and white, and you see, strikes. Right? Bomb strikes from a distance. We have then, one of the things that happens when the Soviet Union falls apart is the Soviet Union was holding together and had put together a lot of countries as nations that didn't like each other. Okay? And they were basically held at bay after centuries of hostility. They were held at bay by the structure of the nation. Okay? And so we start seeing things split apart. Now, the Czech Republic and the Slovakia, they split very amicably. Czech Republic's like, this is ours, right? And Slovakia's like, yeah, this is ours. And we're like, yeah, that's cool. And they're done. That was it, right? Easy peasy. Other things did not go as well. There's ethnic cleansing in Kosovo in 1999. My husband, as a Marine, was there in Bosnia in 1995. Yes, it was that sort of terrible place. The United Nations, NATO at that time kind of tied hands. There wasn't a lot that they could do. A lot of what they did was witness what happened. During the 1990s, we had a series of these conflicts. And it should be noted that, during this period of time, too, Osama bin Laden, in 1993, has the first attack on the World Trade Center. There are also some attacks on U.S. soft targets during this period of time. The Clinton administration says this is our number one threat. Watch out for this dude. We've been trying to get him. But the media said, you just don't want us to pay attention to the fact that, you're having sex with your intern. And he's like, no, I'm serious. Right? They even made a movie called Wag the Dog as a parody of this, right? That he was making it up. They felt kind of stupid when 9/11 happened. So, the World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks happened on 9/11. Some of the pilots trained here in Norman through OU, the Aviation Center. U.S. was not prepared for this sort of terrorist activity. We hadn't had a hijacking of a U.S. plane since the 1970s. And hijacking, people carry guns, right? Not box cutters. In addition, we weren't prepared for the Middle East as a theater. We had too few linguists. We didn't focus enough on the threat of terrorism. Part of that really was pushback against the Clinton administration saying, hey, we need to pay attention, and could not get Congress on board. The main problem with the war on terror is it's aimed at groups instead of nations. Who do you target? Right? Who's a terrorist? That person over there? It's hard. And we have a lack of defined battlefronts. Where are we supposed to be fighting this war? We entered Afghanistan because the Taliban controlled Afghanistan and they gave succor to Osama bin Laden. And so that is where we attacked. But we went into Iraq for a different reason. George W. Bush is going to put out the Preemptive War Doctrine, the idea that we attack someone who could potentially harm us before they harm us, right? This is obviously against the UN Charter. There's no question about that. The rationale for the war was suspected weapons of mass destruction. Iraq had some weapons of mass destruction. They were older. We had given them to them in the 1980s when they were fighting Iran. We knew they had them because we gave them to them. Post-war Iraq has been very unstable. I'm not saying that we should not promote democracy. I'm not saying that Saddam Hussein was a good guy. I am saying it was stable. So this heavy involvement in Iraq limited our ability to respond on other fronts. So that meant we didn't pay enough attention to Afghanistan where we already were. It meant we couldn't pay enough attention to what else was going on, the spread of the Islamic State. We had this waning public support for it. We see it in the election of 2004, or it's already waning at that point. So in 2007, we had this big surge. We're going to go in, we're going to finish it, and we're going to get out. That was not successful. We did get out. The surge was less than successful. The Taliban is going to reassert control in Afghanistan. Pakistan is going to be used as a safe haven for the Taliban. We're going to capture Osama bin Laden under President Obama. We have the Afghan surge trying to do the same thing. Can we draw down Afghanistan troops? Now, President Obama was elected in 2008 with the idea that he would end the war in Afghanistan and the Middle East. President Trump was elected in 2016 with the promise he would get troops out of the Middle East. Joe Biden didn't promise anything, but he got troops out of the Middle East, and he lost 12 approval points for it. There's a high political cost. So it's tough for politicians to make those choices. During this time, too, we have the Arab Spring. This is happening in the 2000s. We have unrest and protests in Tunisia. It's going to spread to Egypt and to nearly every Arab country. It's spread by social media, right? So we're talking 2012, 2013, 2014, okay? It's spread by social media. This is the big democratization that goes on as a result. We were completely surprised by it. We had not been putting that sort of support in it, but the U.S. did, along with NATO, help out in Libya, say, hey, we're going to see what we can do to help you out in Libya. That did not work very well. We also have the same thing going on in Syria. The United States also threw support there. One of the things that Hillary Clinton caught a lot of flack for is the fact that she advocated for that as Secretary of State. And we have the rise of ISIS in Syria, Iraq, Libya, throughout the Middle East. ISIS has been mostly neutralized at this point. But the Taliban have taken back over Afghanistan. And things are continuing to be very unstable. These are the nationalities of ISIS foreign fighters. Quite a bit of them are Russian. As you can see, the majority are Russian. So again, are we going back to a Cold War, proxy war happening? We haven't even talked about the Ukraine. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Tunisia, France, Morocco, Turkey, Uzbekistan, some German, some British. These are people who feel that the NATO and U.S. presence in the Middle East is unfair and undermining the ability of the people to choose for themselves what they want. Right? So where are we now? Well, President Biden, maybe reviving the Truman Doctrine, you know? Let's contain, not necessarily communism, but totalitarianism where it is. Let's not let totalitarianism spread. President Trump's was America First. It's not clearly defined in terms of the military, okay? It's difficult to define that in terms of the military. But in other ways, it was clear. Talks, trade in particular. Biden has talks with Southeast Asia and China, re-trade. You know, we've opened up those trade routes that have been closed down. President Trump removed us from the TPP, that's the Pacific Trade Agreement, all right? There were some issues with it that were disliked on both sides. Free trade versus fair trade. Do you guys know what the difference is? What's the difference? You're like, I'm nodding my head. Free trade versus fair trade. Free trade means you can basically trade freely with no tariffs, no taxes on what you're importing or exporting or anything like that. That's free trade, okay? Fair trade means that you cannot do that unless your people are paid a living wage. You can't use prison labor, okay? Fair trade says, hey, look, we think you ought to be able to trade freely, but you also have to treat your economy freely. And you can't also help, right? The WTO deals with that too. You can't give subsidies and then say, yeah, so this is the price, and then flood markets, right? That's unfair trade, okay? With immigration, President Trump is going to institute a travel ban from some places in the world, particularly those who have higher Muslim populations. He's going to stop DACA. Do you know what DACA is? What's DACA? What's DACA? Say it again? Deferred action for childhood arrivals, which means what? Not deporting children who are brought by their parents illegally into the United States, okay? Because they are children, right? Because they're children. And so 2.6 miles of wall was built. 3,000 children were removed from their parents at the border. And we set our refugee cap at the lowest it's ever been since we've had a refugee cap, which is 100 years. Not allowing people who are seeking freedom, democracy, etc. Under President Biden, DACA is back on. The children are reunified with their parents at this point. It took a little time. In the Middle East, under President Trump, we have strikes against Syria. We leave the Iran nuclear deal. We recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We don't have time to talk about that today. Support Saudi Arabia. Drone strikes against IS leaders, and Iranian leader as well. Assassination actions, actually, not attempts. In the Middle East, we're going to re-enter the Iran deal, saying, hey, we were cool with you not using nuclear power to build nuclear weapons. Let's go back to that. Okay? So we re-enter that, and we withdraw all troops from Afghanistan. In terms of diplomacy, President Trump is going to leave the United Nations Human Rights Council, which was created by who? Eleanor Roosevelt. That's right. Snubs all NATO and Western leaders. I mean, like literally pushes aside Angela Merkel. You know. Befriends Putin and Kim Jong-un. Withdraws from the World Health Organization over COVID-19 and leaves the Open Skies Agreement. Okay? Under Biden, back in the UN Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization, the Open Sky. But Russia is going to remove their ambassadors because we are investigating them for interfering in elections. So, strained relations with Russia because we're investigating them. Environment, President Trump's going to leave the Paris Agreement and Biden's going to rejoin it. There are some other things too, but in some. So, when we talk about nuclear war, because we still need to talk about nuclear war, because understand that, there are giant missile silos in Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska that still hold nuclear missiles. Okay? South Dakota. But there are also nuclear weapons that someone can carry around. I want you to think about that. Because we are no longer fighting in a bipolar world, that means that there are many active groups to whom no one has allegiance who are seeking nuclear capability. And Russia needs money. They're in bad shape right now. Probably the worst shape they've been in 25 years. And at that point, they were selling things off too, 25 years ago. We do have mutually assured destruction. Should we engage with Russia? Still. Land, air, sea, we have a nuclear triad. Like I said, missile silos in Oklahoma. Nuclear submarines. We can drop them out of planes. Okay? But again, the biggest threat is the idea of a rogue nation or terrorist group having nuclear power. Because if they don't care if they die, then mutually assured destruction is not a deterrent. If they don't care if the world burns, everybody, them too, then it is not a deterrent. In terms of conventional war, the U.S. capabilities are two simultaneous medium-sized wars. We drew down a lot in Europe and then have been building back up more recently. We actually only had two theaters, the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so the Pacific theater was in charge of the Middle East. We are now, that has been changed in the last 20 years. We have 3 theaters at this point. We are not capable of fighting wars on all 3 theaters. We have a highly advanced weapon system. I mean, it's really good. It can it can kill people very effectively. And we have an all-volunteer military. This is important because in World War II and World War I and Korea and Vietnam, we did not. Which meant that people got a lot more upset when people died. As it is now, you sign up, and you signed up, so you signed up. Thank you for your service. Sorry you died. But if your son went, and he didn't sign up, then you're a lot angrier. In 2012, like I said, we pulled the focus away from Europe and changed the training element, but we still do have a European theater there as well. And we built it back up more recently. In terms of unconventional war, unconventional attacks and tactics, you know, there's that whole thing that we did following World War II, which is known as the Marshall Plan, radio-free Europe, rock and roll. Seriously. That's how we win Eastern Europe. Because we have better music. Which we do. But the U.S. military struggles to adapt to that, right? Winning hearts and minds, you can't shoot somebody, right? And that's not what you're trained to do, right? You're not trained to win a heart and mind. That's a diplomacy thing. And our diplomacy budget has been drawn down. Our humanitarian budget's been drawn down pretty significant. We've had a lot of reforms to make the military better to combat unconventional warfare, but that's combat. And again, it's not hearts and minds. It's more how to fight the city. So here we are, countries with the highest military spending worldwide in 2020. Eric, can you see this poll on yours? I'd like to see it. The United States, as you can see, spends the most. And just for contrast, the United States spends more than the next 7 countries put together. Okay? 41% of what is spent, oh actually 3, 4, 5, 7, yeah, 7 countries put together. 41% of what's spent by the United States of the world, of what's spent on the military is spent by the United States. So when we talk about not wanting to be the world's policeman, then the question is why are we paying to be the world's policeman? Right? If people say, hey look, we don't want to be the world's police, then stop spending that much on the military because I don't think you have a shot. I don't think you have a choice. So my question is, how much should the U.S. spend on the military? What do you think? And I just want you to know, this has nothing to do with what soldiers pay. That's not where the money is.